It was the dawn of a new civilization along the North African coast, a settlement founded by the seafaring Phoenicians, who hailed from the city of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. By 814 BC, this settlement would grow into what we now know as Carthage, a name that would soon echo across the Mediterranean. Nestled along the strategic and resource-rich coastline of present-day Tunisia, Carthage would become one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and influence, embodying the spirit of its Phoenician founders while shaping an identity all its own. As Carthage evolved from a mere trading post to a vibrant city-state, it quickly developed into a central hub for trade and maritime commerce. Carthaginian merchants traveled far and wide, venturing to the coasts of Europe, down into the unknown realms of Africa, and westward to the Iberian Peninsula. These ambitious traders not only brought back valuable resources, gold, silver, ivory, and exotic spices, but also fostered relationships with foreign lands, spreading Carthage's influence well beyond its shores. Every return voyage enriched Carthage, filling its markets with the sounds, smells, and textures of distant lands. Markets thrummed with energy as merchants bartered goods from across the known world, creating a tapestry of cultural diversity. With each passing year, Carthage's coffers grew, and so did its influence, marking the early stages of an empire that would challenge Rome itself. Yet Carthage's rise to power was not purely economic. To defend its interests and secure trade routes, Carthage developed a formidable navy, unmatched by any of its contemporaries. Massive warships, known as quinquiremes, patrolled the waters of the Mediterranean, their presence a powerful reminder of Carthage's strength and reach. These ships were marvels of engineering, featuring 5 rows of oars and carrying hundreds of men. They dominated naval battles and projected Carthaginian influence across the sea. The might of the Carthaginian navy became legendary, inspiring fear and respect among its neighbors. No fleet could challenge Carthage on open waters, and through this strength, Carthage secured its place as the dominant force in the western Mediterranean. Politically, Carthage was a complex society, ruled by an oligarchy of wealthy aristocrats, merchants, and influential families who wielded considerable power. The government was divided between the Council of Elders, who advised on military and foreign affairs, and the Assembly of Citizens, a gathering of the elite that made important decisions on matters of trade and commerce. This structure allowed Carthage to adapt swiftly to the needs of its people while preserving the interests of its ruling class. However, this power was not without its internal struggles. Factions within the ruling elite often clashed over the direction of the city, with one group advocating for expansion into Africa and another focused on securing dominance over the Mediterranean. These tensions would play a crucial role in the city's future, shaping its foreign policy and military strategies. Religion held a significant place in Carthaginian life. The Carthaginians worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, chief among them Baal-Hamon, the god of fertility and weather, and Tanit, the goddess of love, fertility, and warfare. At the height of their devotion, Carthaginians believed that their gods could directly influence their lives, guiding their military endeavors and ensuring the success of their ventures. Temples adorned the city's skyline, filled with offerings of food, pottery, and animals. And, although controversial to outsiders, Carthaginian religious practices included ritualistic sacrifices. Some historical accounts suggest that even children were sacrificed during times of dire need, though the exact nature of these sacrifices remains debated among historians. For the Carthaginians, these acts were seen as offerings to secure the gods' favor, a way to ensure that Carthage would thrive and remain prosperous. As the Carthaginian Empire grew, so did its ambitions. Its leaders cast their gaze upon new lands and resources, extending their reach into territories that would yield wealth, power, and influence. By the 4th century BC, Carthage controlled parts of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula. Its wealth became legendary, rivaling that of the ancient empires of Egypt and Persia. The economy flourished, driven by agriculture, mining, and commerce. Carthaginian coins bearing the symbols of its gods and kings circulated throughout the Mediterranean, a symbol of the city's power and prestige. These coins, minted in silver and bronze, became a source of pride and identity, reinforcing Carthage's reputation as a prosperous and influential state. But as Carthage expanded, so too did its enemies. Greek city-states in Sicily, alarmed by Carthaginian encroachment, resisted fiercely. The island of Sicily became a battleground, with Carthaginian and Greek forces clashing repeatedly in brutal conflicts that would span generations. The Greeks were skilled fighters and formidable opponents, well versed in both land and naval warfare. Despite their strength, Carthage managed to establish a foothold on the island, maintaining control over its territories through sheer resilience and determination. The struggle for Sicily was a bitter and costly affair, but Carthage remained resolute, seeing the island as crucial to its dominance over the Mediterranean. The Greeks, however, were not Carthage's only rivals. To the northeast, across the Tyrrhenian Sea, another power was rising. Rome, a city founded on the principles of military discipline, honor, and conquest, was beginning to assert its influence. Although still small compared to Carthage, Rome had an insatiable hunger for expansion and was unafraid to challenge those who stood in its way. Initially, Carthage and Rome maintained a diplomatic relationship, with trade agreements that benefited both sides. Carthaginian merchants traded goods in Rome, and Roman wine made its way to Carthage. For a time, it seemed that the two powers could coexist, each respecting the other's territories and interests. But peace between Carthage and Rome was tenuous. Both were growing powers with ambitions that were bound to clash. The seeds of conflict were sown in Sicily, where Carthaginian and Roman interests collided. Rome viewed Carthaginian expansion with suspicion, seeing it as a potential threat to its own future dominance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the ancient world, a conflict that would test the strength, resilience, and spirit of Carthage to its very core. Thus, Carthage found itself at a crossroads. Would it continue to expand and risk confrontation with the ambitious city of Rome, or would it retreat, preserving its wealth and influence within its current borders? For the Carthaginians, the answer was clear. They would not back down. Carthage was a city born from ambition and driven by an indomitable spirit. Its people had braved the seas, established colonies, and created an empire that was the envy of the ancient world. To retreat now would be to abandon everything they had worked for. And so, Carthage prepared itself for the struggles to come, standing resolute in the face of adversity, unaware of the monumental challenges that lay ahead. The Mediterranean Sea was no stranger to conflict. Throughout its history, it had been the conduit of countless empires' ambitions and the stage for innumerable battles. And now, in the early 4th century BC, it was Sicily, the island of rich resources and strategic positioning, that had captured the attention of the Carthaginians. With its fertile plains, thriving colonies, and influence over key maritime routes, Sicily was a prize that both the Carthaginians and the Greeks sought to control. But in this age of city-states, territories were rarely won through diplomacy alone. The Carthaginian military machine was well prepared for the challenges Sicily presented. Unlike Rome, which favored conscripted citizen soldiers, Carthage relied on a professional army composed largely of foreign mercenaries. Numidians from North Africa, Iberians from the Iberian Peninsula, and skilled archers from the Balearic Islands, all fought under the Carthaginian banner, united by a mutual desire for wealth and glory. To many Carthaginians, the concept of a standing army was foreign. They left the fighting to professionals, content to wield their own influence in the markets and governing councils. This strategy allowed Carthage to quickly amass experienced soldiers, adapting its forces to suit the needs of each battlefield. As Carthaginian generals like Mago and Hamilcar prepared for Sicily, they knew they were equipped with some of the most elite forces in the ancient world. Sicily was not only a fertile land but a cultural tapestry, woven together by the Greek settlers who had made it their home centuries before. Greek city-states like Syracuse, Acragas, and Selinus had established strongholds across the island, creating a network of colonies that rivaled Carthage's own in wealth and power. These cities were independent and fiercely protective of their autonomy, bound together by a common Greek identity and a shared determination to resist foreign invaders. Among them, Syracuse was the most formidable, a city of immense wealth and military prowess, ruled by the tyrant Dionysius I, who was as cunning as he was ruthless. Under his leadership, Syracuse had grown into a powerful city-state, expanding its influence across the island and beyond. Dionysius saw himself as a bulwark against Carthaginian expansion, and he was prepared to fight to the last to preserve Greek control over Sicily. The opening skirmishes of the Carthaginian-Greek conflict in Sicily were brutal and relentless. Carthage's generals were strategic, launching sudden assaults on vulnerable Greek colonies, aiming to wear down the enemy's defenses and spread their forces thin. The mercenaries fought with ferocity, knowing that their pay, and perhaps their lives, depended on victory. Numidian cavalry harassed Greek supply lines, while Balearic slingers unleashed deadly volleys upon the Greek phalanxes. In response, the Greeks fortified their cities, transforming them into near-impenetrable fortresses. Every town and village became a battlefield, and the lush fields of Sicily were soon marked by the scars of war. However, Dionysius was not content with a purely defensive approach. The Greek tyrant launched a series of counteroffensives, determined to push the Carthaginians back to their homeland. His forces were well-trained, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, drawn from all over the Greek world to fight in what they saw as a war of survival. Dionysius employed advanced siege techniques, using catapults and battering rams to tear down Carthaginian fortifications. He was a master of psychological warfare, spreading rumors of Carthaginian brutality to rally his troops and inspire the Sicilian populace to resist. The battles raged on for years, with either side able to gain a decisive advantage. Amidst the chaos, ordinary Sicilians suffered immensely. Farmers were forced to abandon their fields, as armies trampled through their lands, destroying crops and livestock. Villages were burned, families displaced, and the specter of hunger loomed over the island. Both Carthaginian and Greek soldiers raided local settlements for supplies, often leaving little behind for the people who lived there. Sicily, once a land of prosperity and culture, had become a war-torn wasteland, caught in the crossfire of two mighty powers. As the war dragged on, it became clear that Carthage's strategy of attrition was taking its toll on both sides. The Carthaginian generals realized that to achieve a lasting victory, they needed to strike at the heart of the Greek resistance. The decision was made to lay siege to Syracuse itself, the bastion of Greek power on the island. It was a daunting task. Syracuse was well defended, with towering walls, a powerful fleet, and an army of loyal warriors ready to defend their city. But for the Carthaginians, the prize was worth the risk. Capturing Syracuse would not only break Greek power in Sicily but also send a message to all who opposed Carthage: resistance was futile. The siege of Syracuse was one of the most intense and prolonged in ancient history. Carthaginian engineers constructed massive siege engines, including towers and battering rams, to breach the city's formidable walls. The Carthaginian navy blockaded the port, cutting off Syracuse from supplies and reinforcements. Inside the city, the people of Syracuse endured terrible hardships. Food became scarce, disease spread through the crowded streets, and morale began to falter. But Dionysius was not a leader who would surrender easily. He rallied his people, inspiring them with speeches of resistance and defiance. He promised them that Syracuse would stand firm against the invaders, no matter the cost. In a desperate bid to break the siege, Dionysius launched a surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet. Under the cover of night, Greek ships sailed out of the harbor, setting fire to Carthaginian vessels and wreaking havoc among the enemy's ranks. The attack was a stunning success, forcing the Carthaginians to retreat temporarily and allowing Syracuse to resupply. This victory gave the people of Syracuse renewed hope, and for a brief moment, it seemed that they might be able to withstand Carthage's onslaught. But Carthage was relentless. They regrouped, repaired their ships, and tightened the blockade, determined to see the siege through to the bitter end. After months of fighting, the siege of Syracuse came to a bloody conclusion. Weakened by famine, disease, and relentless assaults, the city finally fell to the Carthaginians. The walls were breached, and Carthaginian soldiers poured into the city, overwhelming the exhausted defenders. Syracuse, once a proud symbol of Greek power, was left in ruins. The streets were filled with the cries of the defeated, as Carthaginian forces claimed their prize. For Carthage, the fall of Syracuse was a moment of triumph, a testament to their strength and determination. But it was also a costly victory. The war had drained Carthage's resources and exacted a heavy toll on its people. With Greek resistance broken, Carthage now held undisputed control over the western Mediterranean. But the price of this victory was high. The prolonged conflict had strained Carthage's finances, weakened its military, and sown the seeds of unrest within its own population. Carthage had won the battle for Sicily, but it had also gained a powerful enemy. Across the sea, in the city of Rome, leaders watched Carthage's expansion with growing alarm. They saw in Carthage a rival that could one day threaten their own ambitions, a rival that had to be stopped. The Mediterranean was now a basin divided between two rising powers, Carthage and Rome. On one side, Carthage held mastery over the seas and had spent generations refining its mercantile empire and military might. On the other, Rome had steadily grown from a small city-state to a disciplined republic with a strong, determined army. The two powers had coexisted uneasily, each aware of the other's expanding influence but hesitant to clash directly. That all changed with the eruption of the First Punic War in 264 BC, a conflict that would last over 2 decades and leave both empires forever changed. It all began in the city of Messana, a small but strategically located city on the northeastern coast of Sicily. Messana was key, both geographically and politically, as it sat at the narrowest point between Sicily and the Italian Peninsula. Whoever controlled Messana controlled the straits and held a crucial foothold in Sicily. At the time, Messana was held by a group of mercenaries known as the Mamertines. These warriors of Italian descent had seized the city and were constantly at odds with both Carthage and Syracuse. When the Greek city of Syracuse laid siege to Messana, the Mamertines, desperate and facing annihilation, turned to Rome for aid. Rome, always on the lookout for opportunities to curb Carthaginian power, saw the chance to establish a presence in Sicily, and so they agreed to intervene. For Carthage, Rome's move into Sicily was a grave provocation. Sicily had long been Carthage's sphere of influence, and the thought of a Roman garrison on the island was unacceptable. In response, Carthage quickly mobilized forces to protect its interests, sending soldiers and warships to Messana to confront the Roman incursion. Thus, the First Punic War began, a war fought not for survival, but for dominance, as both powers sought to expand their influence across the Mediterranean. The initial battles were brutal and chaotic, fought on land and sea by forces unaccustomed to each other's tactics. Roman legions, renowned for their discipline and organization, clashed with the Carthaginian forces, who relied heavily on their experienced mercenaries and formidable naval fleet. Carthaginian commanders, well versed in siege warfare, attempted to use their naval superiority to blockade Roman positions and prevent reinforcements. But the Romans, undeterred, developed new strategies, adapting quickly to the challenges of naval combat despite their inexperience on the water. One of Rome's most innovative adaptations was the invention of the corvus, a boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to turn a naval battle into a land engagement. The corvus was essentially a bridge with a metal spike on the end. When a Roman ship came close to a Carthaginian vessel, the corvus would drop down, latch onto the enemy's deck, and provide a path for Roman soldiers to board and fight hand to hand. This tactic proved devastatingly effective, allowing the Romans to overcome Carthaginian ships in several key battles. Despite their lack of experience at sea, the Romans fought with tenacity, determined to match Carthage's naval power. As the war dragged on, both sides suffered heavy losses. The battles were grueling, often fought over the same territories as each side struggled to maintain control. Sicily's cities, towns, and farmland became battlegrounds once more, and the people of the island bore the brunt of the conflict. Farmers fled their fields, merchants lost their livelihoods, and families were torn apart as the war engulfed the land. For the Carthaginians and the Romans, Sicily was no longer just a strategic point. It was a symbol of their struggle for dominance over the Mediterranean. And neither side was willing to back down. The financial toll of the war was staggering. Carthage's treasury, already stretched from previous conflicts, was drained further as the city hired more mercenaries, built new ships, and supplied its forces across the sea. In Rome, the cost was no less severe. The Senate struggled to fund the war effort, and ordinary Romans were called upon to make sacrifices. Wealthy citizens financed ships, farmers were conscripted into the army, and the city itself endured hardships as resources were diverted to the front. The war was consuming both empires from within, forcing them to exhaust their resources in pursuit of victory. After years of back-and-forth battles, the war reached a critical juncture. Rome launched a massive invasion of North Africa, hoping to strike at the heart of Carthage itself. The invasion force was led by the Roman consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, who achieved several early successes, defeating Carthaginian forces and marching toward the city of Carthage. For a moment, it seemed as if Rome might achieve total victory. But Carthage, desperate and on the verge of collapse, hired a Greek mercenary general named Xanthippus, whose knowledge of battlefield tactics and experience with phalanx formations turned the tide. Under Xanthippus' leadership, the Carthaginians defeated Regulus's army, capturing the consul himself and forcing the Romans to retreat. Back in Sicily, the war ground on. Towns and fortresses changed hands repeatedly, as each side sought to gain the upper hand. Carthage's navy remained a formidable force, and Roman forces faced constant challenges in maintaining supply lines across the sea. The Roman Senate, unwilling to admit defeat, continued to pour resources into the conflict, determined to break Carthage's hold on the island. Over the years, the conflict began to shift toward naval supremacy, with each side building and losing fleets in a series of costly and destructive battles. Finally, after more than 2 decades of fighting, the war culminated in a decisive engagement. In 241 BC, the two navies met off the coast of the Aegates Islands. Rome, having learned from years of naval defeats, had built a new fleet, funded largely through public donations and staffed with experienced crews. The Roman fleet, commanded by Gaius Lutatius Catulus, employed new tactics that allowed them to outmaneuver and overwhelm the Carthaginians. In a stunning victory, Rome destroyed the Carthaginian fleet, cutting off Carthage's ability to resupply its forces in Sicily and effectively ending the war. Carthage, exhausted and financially ruined, had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Lutatius, signed in 241 BC, forced Carthage to cede control of Sicily to Rome, pay a massive indemnity, and dismantle much of its once mighty navy. For Rome, the victory was momentous. It marked the beginning of Roman dominance in the Mediterranean and laid the foundations for the Republic's transformation into an empire. For Carthage, it was a bitter defeat, one that would sow the seeds of resentment and set the stage for the next, even more devastating, conflict with Rome. Following the catastrophic loss of the First Punic War, Carthage found itself at a crossroads. Financially drained, politically fractured, and militarily weakened, the once proud empire faced an uncertain future. Yet Carthage was resilient, and the citizens and leaders alike were determined to restore their homeland's strength. The harsh terms imposed by Rome through the Treaty of Lutatius had crippled Carthage's economy, but Carthage was not defeated in spirit. Its vast trading network remained intact, and the merchant elite began to rebuild the economy, using their resources and connections to regain prosperity. As Carthage worked to stabilize internally, political tensions brewed within. Factions argued over the best course forward. Some advocated appeasement and cooperation with Rome, while others, notably led by the influential Barcid family, urged preparation for a future rematch. At the head of this movement was Hamilcar Barca, a charismatic and ambitious general who had survived the First Punic War and harbored a deep resentment toward Rome. Hamilcar saw Carthage's defeat not as an end but as a stepping stone, a lesson in humility that could fuel their resurgence. In Hamilcar's mind, Carthage's future lay not in merely rebuilding but in reclaiming its lost honor and power. Realizing the importance of strong leadership, Carthage granted Hamilcar command of its forces in North Africa. His immediate focus was on securing Carthage's remaining territories and stabilizing the western Mediterranean. Under Hamilcar's guidance, Carthaginian forces subdued rebellious territories and enforced order, displaying a ruthless efficiency that earned him respect and fear in equal measure. But Hamilcar's true vision extended far beyond mere stabilization. He saw an opportunity to build a power base in Iberia, modern-day Spain, a resource-rich land that promised both wealth and strategic advantage. In 237 BC, Hamilcar led an expedition to Iberia, determined to establish a new Carthaginian foothold. Over the next several years, he worked tirelessly to conquer and assimilate the tribes of Iberia, amassing wealth through the region's silver mines and creating a formidable Carthaginian presence. His vision was grand. An Iberian stronghold could provide Carthage with the resources and manpower necessary to challenge Rome once more. Through a combination of diplomacy and force, Hamilcar secured Carthage's influence in Iberia, laying the foundation for a new empire beyond Rome's immediate reach. Yet, Hamilcar's ambitions did not go unnoticed. Rome, wary of Carthage's resurgence in Iberia, kept a close watch on Hamilcar's activities. The Roman Senate debated whether to intervene, but memories of the costly First Punic War lingered, and Rome hesitated to provoke another confrontation. Instead, the Roman Republic opted for a strategy of containment, solidifying alliances with Iberian tribes opposed to Carthage and fortifying its holdings in southern Italy. While Carthage grew in Iberia, Rome consolidated its power, aware that it might one day face its old rival once again. As Hamilcar expanded Carthage's influence in Iberia, he trained his sons in the art of war, instilling in them a fierce loyalty to Carthage and a deep-seated enmity toward Rome. His eldest son, Hannibal, absorbed his father's hatred for Rome and embraced his vision of Carthaginian resurgence. Under Hamilcar's mentorship, Hannibal learned the intricacies of military strategy, guerrilla warfare, and the power of calculated diplomacy. It was in Iberia that young Hannibal vowed never to befriend Rome, a promise that would shape the course of history. Tragically, Hamilcar's ambitious plans were cut short when he died in battle against a local tribe. His legacy, however, endured through his sons and the foundations he had laid in Iberia. Leadership of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, who continued to expand Carthage's control over the region. Hasdrubal founded the city of Carthage, New Carthage, as the capital of Carthage's Iberian territories, further solidifying the new empire's base of power. As Carthage's influence in Iberia grew, tensions with Rome escalated once more. The Roman Senate, alarmed by the growing power of the Barcid dynasty, watched warily as Carthage extended its reach into central and eastern Iberia. By 226 BC, the two powers negotiated a tenuous peace, agreeing that Carthage would not expand north of the Ebro River. But this treaty was fragile, and both sides knew it was merely a temporary measure. The memory of the First Punic War lingered in their minds, and a new generation, led by Hannibal Barca, was preparing to reignite the conflict. The stage was set for a rematch. Carthage had rebuilt its power, Rome had solidified its dominance over Italy, and both empires stood on the brink of another monumental clash. As the Carthaginians looked to the horizon, their eyes were set on a path that would soon lead to one of the most legendary wars in history, the Second Punic War. As the Carthaginian presence in Iberia solidified, young Hannibal Barca was growing into a formidable leader under the watchful eye of his family. With the blood of Hamilcar coursing through his veins, Hannibal inherited not only a deep strategic mind but also an unyielding desire for vengeance against Rome. The vow he had taken as a child, to forever oppose Rome, was no mere gesture. It was a mission that would define his life. Now, as he assumed command of Carthaginian forces in Iberia, Hannibal's thoughts constantly drifted toward the Italian Peninsula, and the rival that stood between him and his destiny. Under Hannibal's command, the Carthaginian army became a well-oiled machine, renowned for its discipline, tactical flexibility, and brutal efficiency. Unlike traditional armies, Hannibal trained his men in varied tactics. They could engage in conventional battles but were also adept at guerrilla warfare, making them versatile and deadly. Every maneuver, every drill was part of Hannibal's grander vision, to shape an army capable of not only fighting the Roman legions but overcoming them. His soldiers saw him as more than just a leader, they saw him as the embodiment of Carthage's rebirth, a warrior who would avenge their people's humiliations. The strength of Carthage's new army lay not just in its training, but in its diversity. Hannibal recruited warriors from the various Iberian tribes, each bringing unique skills to the ranks. Iberian light infantry, known for their speed and agility, complemented the African heavy infantry, while Numidian cavalrymen were skilled in hit-and-run tactics that could disrupt even the most organized formations. Hannibal understood the potential of this multi-ethnic army, blending the strengths of each group into a cohesive fighting force. It was an approach that defied traditional military logic yet promised a new kind of warfare, one that Rome was unprepared to face. Hannibal's ambitions for his army extended beyond mere military might. He fostered a deep sense of loyalty among his soldiers. Known for leading from the front, Hannibal shared in the hardships of the march and the dangers of the battlefield. This bond between Hannibal and his troops would become a cornerstone of Carthage's strategy, a force multiplier that would prove invaluable in the grueling campaigns to come. His men saw themselves not merely as soldiers but as the harbingers of Carthage's revenge, bound to their commander by an unbreakable oath of loyalty and vengeance. Yet Hannibal was more than just a warrior. He was a master of psychological warfare. He understood the importance of instilling fear in his enemies and crafted a reputation that spread across the Mediterranean. Rome knew of Hannibal, heard tales of his ruthlessness and cunning, and whispers of his approach grew into waves of fear that rippled through the Republic. The Romans remembered their bitter battles with Carthage and feared the rise of a new leader, one who seemed destined to challenge their supremacy. The Roman Senate was torn. Some senators believed that Carthage, after its losses in the First Punic War, would pose no significant threat. Others, however, feared that Hannibal's ambitions would ultimately lead to conflict. To mitigate the risk, Rome strengthened its alliances in the region and kept a close watch on Carthage's activities in Iberia. For Hannibal, Rome's reaction only reinforced his belief that the time was coming when Carthage would have to face its enemy once more. The treaty forbidding Carthage to expand north of the Ebro River stood as a constant reminder of Rome's control, a boundary that gnawed at Hannibal's resolve. In a bold move, Hannibal prepared his forces to cross the Ebro. His pretext was simple: an alliance with the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally located south of the river. Rome had insisted on the treaty as a condition of peace, but Hannibal considered it an unjust limitation imposed by an occupying force. To him, Saguntum was a symbol of Roman arrogance and expansionism. By attacking Saguntum, Hannibal would send a clear message: Carthage was ready to rise again, and Rome would have to contend with its former rival. With every soldier, every weapon, and every strategy finely honed, Hannibal crossed the threshold into open rebellion. As he mobilized his forces, Hannibal knew that the journey ahead would be brutal. Rome's military might was vast, its legions disciplined and feared across the world. But Hannibal had faith not only in his troops but in his strategy, one that would take the Romans by surprise and redefine the way wars were fought. The coming invasion was more than a campaign. It was a test of wills, a clash of civilizations. For Carthage, for his family, and for his own legacy, Hannibal was ready to challenge the Roman Republic itself. With the siege of Saguntum underway, Rome issued an ultimatum: either Carthage would surrender Hannibal to face Roman justice, or Rome would declare war. Carthage, galvanized by Hannibal's victories and his unyielding spirit, refused. War was now inevitable, and Hannibal prepared his army for an audacious plan: an invasion of Italy that would defy the odds and strike at the heart of Rome. The year is 1916, and the Western Front, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, is dominated by trench warfare. The war, now in its second year, had left millions dead, wounded, or missing. The land itself, ravaged by unrelenting bombardments, had become a grim landscape of mud, barbed wire, and craters. This battlefield was where the fate of the First World War would be decided, and it was here that the strategies of generals and the resolve of soldiers would collide in one of the bloodiest and most infamous chapters of the conflict. The Western Front represented a dichotomy. The British and French forces were engaged in a bitter struggle to break through the German lines, while the Germans themselves were desperately trying to hold on to their positions. The war on the Western Front had become a war of attrition, a battle not just for land but for survival. It was here, amid the smoke and the mud, that the two sides would clash in a manner that would alter the course of history. At the beginning of 1916, the Allied forces were in desperate need of a breakthrough. The war had reached a stalemate, with either side able to gain a decisive advantage. The trench systems had become so entrenched that soldiers often lived and died within mere meters of one another, caught in a constant cycle of bombardment, attack, and retreat. The constant stalemate, though exhausting, was also a sign that the war would not end quickly. The generals, both Allied and German, knew that the only way to win would be to shatter the enemy's will to continue the fight. One of the most significant events of 1916, and the year's defining battle, would be the Battle of the Somme. For the British, this battle was to be a pivotal moment, a chance to break through the German defenses and finally make headway into occupied territory. The Germans, on the other hand, were preparing for an attack on the French at Verdun, and they were determined not to give up the high ground of the Somme without a fight. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1, 1916, and it would become one of the bloodiest battles in human history. British forces launched an offensive, hoping to gain significant ground while relieving pressure on the French at Verdun. The idea behind the attack was straightforward. The British would bombard the German positions for a week, hoping to weaken the enemy's defenses, before launching an infantry assault. The British forces believed that the bombardment would cause enough destruction to make it possible to cross no man's land and capture key German positions with minimal resistance. But the reality on the ground was starkly different. The German defenses were much stronger than anticipated. The Germans had dug in, building a complex network of trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. While the British bombardment had indeed caused massive destruction, it was not enough to neutralize the German defenses completely. The German soldiers were well prepared and able to take shelter in underground bunkers, emerging only when the bombardment had ceased. The result was catastrophic. As the British soldiers advanced into no man's land, they were met with a hail of machine gun fire, artillery bombardments, and barbed wire that had not been sufficiently cleared. The initial wave of soldiers, numbering in the tens of thousands, was decimated in just a few hours. The British casualties were staggering, with more than 57,000 soldiers killed or wounded on the first day alone. The first day of the Battle of the Somme remains the single bloodiest day in British military history. The human cost was immense, and the sense of loss and confusion was palpable. Despite the horrific losses, the British continued to press on, determined to break through the German lines. The battle, which was originally planned as a quick strike, turned into a protracted engagement that lasted for months. The terrain of the Somme was difficult, and the weather was often inclement, making the battle even more grueling for the men in the trenches. The fighting continued throughout the summer and into the fall, with both sides suffering unimaginable casualties. As the battle dragged on, the use of tanks marked a significant technological advancement in warfare. The British introduced the first ever tank in the Battle of the Somme, though it was far from the formidable weapon we know today. The early models were slow, prone to breaking down, and often ineffective against entrenched defenses. Nevertheless, they marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one that would shape the future of combat. Tanks would later evolve into the powerful machines that would change the nature of warfare in the years to come. But despite the introduction of new technology, the Battle of the Somme was, in many ways, a failure for the Allies. The British had advanced some distance, but the German defenses were resilient, and the losses were catastrophic. By the end of the battle in November 1916, more than 1 million men from both sides had been killed or wounded, making the Somme one of the bloodiest battles in history. The British forces had gained a mere few miles of territory at an unbearable cost. For the French, the Battle of the Somme was also a devastating experience. The French had been engaged in a brutal battle at Verdun, where they had fought the Germans for months in one of the most harrowing engagements of the war. Verdun became a symbol of French resistance, and its defense was a matter of national pride. The French soldiers, fighting on their own soil, held firm despite the horrific conditions. Verdun would later be regarded as a testament to the endurance and bravery of the French soldiers, but it came at an enormous cost, over 700,000 casualties. The Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme were interwoven in their impact on the overall outcome of the war. The two battles drained the strength of both the German and Allied forces, exhausting their resources and morale. The sheer scale of the loss of life in both engagements had a profound psychological effect on the soldiers, as well as on the civilians who followed the war from afar. The Somme marked a turning point in the war. Despite the staggering losses, the battle demonstrated that the Allies were willing to continue fighting at any cost. The battle also marked a new chapter in the evolution of warfare, with the development of new technologies and tactics. However, it also highlighted the limits of these innovations and the brutality of the war. By the end of 1916, the war had reached a new level of devastation, one that would only escalate in the years to come. In the aftermath of the Somme, both sides retreated to their respective lines, battered but not broken. The war would continue for 2 more years, but the events of 1916 had set the stage for the final stages of the conflict. In the coming months, the nature of warfare would continue to evolve, with new weapons, tactics, and strategies being employed. But for now, the soldiers of the Western Front were left to reflect on the sacrifices made, the horrors endured, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The First World War, although predominantly fought on land, was also a war at sea. While much of the conflict's attention has historically been focused on the trenches of the Western Front, the naval engagements between the world's greatest fleets were equally pivotal in determining the war's outcome. The Battle of Jutland, fought between the British Royal Navy's Grand Fleet and the Imperial German Navy's High Seas Fleet, became the largest naval battle of the First World War, a fight that would shape the strategic balance on the seas and impact the future of naval warfare. The Battle of Jutland took place over the course of a single day, May 31, 1916, but its significance echoed through the rest of the war. It was not only a confrontation between two powerful navies but a critical moment that would determine the fate of Britain's naval dominance and the success of its blockade against Germany. For years, the Royal Navy had reigned supreme on the high seas, its Grand Fleet ensuring that Britain could maintain its vital maritime trade routes. Germany, on the other hand, had been striving to break this dominance, focusing on building a navy capable of challenging the might of the British. The strategic situation was clear. Britain needed to maintain control of the seas to keep its empire and economy intact, while Germany was aiming to break the British blockade and gain access to critical resources from around the world. The German High Seas Fleet, under Admiral Reinhard Scheer, was positioned as a direct challenge to the British Grand Fleet, commanded by Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. Each side had its own objectives. The British aimed to decisively defeat the German fleet, while the Germans hoped to weaken the Royal Navy enough to allow them to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare and break the British blockade. The stage was set for a confrontation of immense importance. The Battle of Jutland began on the morning of May 31, 1916, when British reconnaissance aircraft spotted German ships off the coast of Denmark. This early intelligence prompted the British to scramble their fleet, with Jellicoe commanding a massive force of 151 ships, including 28 battleships. The German fleet, though smaller in size, was no less formidable, comprising 99 ships, including 16 battleships, and it quickly engaged the British in a battle that would ultimately become a tense and unpredictable conflict. The two fleets met at a location roughly 60 miles off the Danish coast, near the Jutland Peninsula. The Royal Navy, with its larger fleet and more experienced sailors, initially appeared to have the advantage. However, the German fleet, under Scheer's command, was more adept at employing modern tactics, leveraging the element of surprise and the advantages of their smaller, more maneuverable ships. The first phase of the battle was marked by the German fleet's sudden appearance. The British were surprised by the German approach, and soon, the fleets were locked in a massive exchange of fire. It was clear that both sides had very different tactics. The British preferred the traditional approach of mass firepower, bringing their big battleships into close range. The Germans, on the other hand, employed a more aggressive strategy, using their smaller, more nimble vessels to harry the British ships and disrupt their lines. The battle soon became a series of back-and-forth encounters, with the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet both sustaining heavy losses. The exchange of fire was brutal, with both sides launching salvo after salvo at one another. As the day progressed, the Royal Navy, which had initially appeared to have the upper hand, began to suffer from a series of strategic blunders. The British had deployed their ships in a way that allowed the Germans to outflank them, leading to a catastrophic series of encounters where British ships were sunk or severely damaged. In the afternoon, the British Grand Fleet was reinforced, but this came at a heavy cost. Many ships, including the iconic British battlecruiser Indefatigable, were sunk in quick succession. The British had underestimated the precision of the German gunnery, and the results were deadly. The Germans, however, were not immune to the deadly fire of the British ships. Their fleet, though smaller in size, took significant losses, including the sinking of the battlecruiser Lutzow and several other important vessels. The final stage of the battle occurred in the evening, as the fleets were separated by darkness. The British, realizing that they had suffered heavy losses and were unable to maintain control of the sea, decided to retreat. Scheer, on the other hand, did not press the advantage as strongly as he might have, partly due to the difficulty of maintaining communication in the chaos of battle and the fear of further British reinforcements. By the end of the day, the Battle of Jutland had concluded with both sides claiming victory, though it was clear that the Royal Navy had suffered greater losses. The British had lost 14 ships, including 4 battleships and 3 battlecruisers, while the Germans lost 11 ships, including 1 battleship and 4 light cruisers. The total number of casualties was staggering, with over 8,000 men killed or wounded on the British side and over 3,000 on the German side. Despite the strategic impact of the battle, the overall outcome did not significantly alter the course of the war. The British were able to maintain their control of the seas and continue their blockade of Germany, which contributed to the eventual starvation of the German population and the collapse of the German war effort in 1918. The Germans, however, were able to claim tactical success, as they had inflicted more damage on the British fleet and achieved their objective of weakening Britain's ability to wage war at sea. The Battle of Jutland, while tactically inconclusive, was strategically significant. It marked the end of the era of big naval battleships, as the nature of naval warfare began to change. The reliance on heavy artillery and massive fleets began to wane, and naval power became more focused on submarines, aircraft, and lighter, faster ships. The introduction of these new technologies would change the face of naval warfare in the decades that followed. In the aftermath of the battle, both the British and the Germans would reassess their naval strategies. The British would continue to dominate the seas, but they would also be more cautious in their approach, understanding that a direct confrontation with the German fleet could lead to heavy losses. For the Germans, the battle reaffirmed their belief in the superiority of their fleet, though it also demonstrated the difficulties of achieving decisive victory in a conflict with a superior naval power. The Battle of Jutland remains a critical event in the history of naval warfare. While it did not alter the outcome of the First World War, it was an important chapter in the evolution of naval strategy, and it set the stage for future conflicts on the seas. For both the British and the Germans, Jutland was a stark reminder of the brutal cost of war, the complexities of modern combat, and the changing nature of military technology. The Battle of Verdun was one of the longest and most grueling engagements of the First World War. It became a symbol of the brutal war of attrition that defined the conflict, where the goal was not to gain territory but to wear down the enemy through relentless casualties and suffering. Verdun, located on the western front of France, would become the site of one of the war's deadliest and most destructive battles, lasting from February 21 to December 18, 1916. It was a test of endurance, where both the French and the Germans were pushed to the brink of exhaustion, physically and mentally. As the war on the Western Front entered its second year, both sides were mired in trench warfare, with neither side able to secure a decisive breakthrough. The war had become a grind, characterized by static lines, massive casualties, and no clear end in sight. The Germans, seeking a way to break the deadlock, focused their attention on Verdun, a French fortress city that had great symbolic importance. To the French, Verdun was not just a military stronghold but a symbol of national pride and resistance. The Germans knew that if they could capture Verdun, they would strike at the heart of French morale. The plan to attack Verdun was devised by German Chief of General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn. His strategy was simple: to inflict such massive casualties on the French that they would be forced to abandon the front and lose the will to fight. Falkenhayn believed that the French would defend Verdun at all costs, and in doing so, would bleed themselves dry in the process. He referred to the plan as a war of attrition, where the goal was not to achieve a military victory, but rather to wear down the enemy through sheer loss of life. The Germans launched their assault on February 21, 1916, with a massive artillery bombardment. For weeks, the skies over Verdun were filled with the thunderous roar of shells as the Germans unleashed a relentless barrage of firepower. The French were taken by surprise, and the bombardment caused widespread panic among the civilian population. But despite the heavy shelling, the French soldiers held their ground, resolute in their determination to defend the city. The French commander at Verdun, Philippe Pétain, famously said, "They shall not pass," a rallying cry that would come to symbolize the French resolve throughout the battle. The initial German attack made significant advances, with German troops pushing the French back. But as the fighting intensified, the French counterattacked, and the battle began to take on a ferocious, season nature. Verdun became a place of constant bloodshed, with soldiers on both sides enduring unimaginable hardships. The French defenders fought in a system of trenches and fortifications, often under constant bombardment, with no respite from the relentless shelling. The Germans, meanwhile, advanced through dense forests and open fields, facing fierce resistance from French forces who had dug in deep. The scale of the battle was immense, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat, bayonet charges, and desperate efforts to hold key positions. The fighting was so intense that soldiers on both sides were often unable to distinguish between friend and foe, and it was not uncommon for men to be surrounded and trapped in the thick mud, their bodies left on the battlefield for days on end. The toll of the battle was staggering, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the end, nearly 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. One of the most brutal aspects of the Battle of Verdun was the constant bombardment. The Germans used heavy artillery to pummel the French defenses, creating a hellish landscape of craters, barbed wire, and ruined trenches. The French were forced to endure wave after wave of artillery fire, with little time to rest or recover. In many cases, the soldiers lived in constant fear of the next shell, never knowing when or where the next explosion would come from. It was a terrifying and exhausting existence, and the psychological toll on the soldiers was immense. But the French defenders were not without support. Over time, reinforcements arrived, and the French managed to regroup and launch counterattacks. The arrival of fresh troops, along with the determination of the French soldiers already at Verdun, allowed the French to hold their ground and gradually push back the German forces. The battle raged on for months, with both sides suffering horrific casualties, but neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough. As the months passed, the Germans began to realize that their plan to break the French morale was not working. The French refused to surrender or retreat, and instead, they dug in even deeper, prepared to fight to the last man. The Germans, exhausted and unable to make further progress, found themselves bogged down in the same mud and trenches that had trapped the French for so long. The battle, which had started with the German goal of causing a quick victory, turned into a drawn-out struggle for survival. The battle's scale and duration took a heavy toll on both sides. The German army, which had initially been confident in its ability to win, found itself increasingly stretched and exhausted. The French, despite their determined defense, also suffered from the psychological and physical exhaustion of prolonged combat. The battle had become a war of attrition in its truest sense, a battle of sheer willpower, where either side could claim a victory, but both sides bled each other dry. By the time the battle finally came to an end in December 1916, Verdun had become a symbol of French resilience and sacrifice. The French had managed to hold the city and repel the German attack, but the cost had been astronomical. The battle had taken such a heavy toll on both sides that it was clear the war would not end quickly. Verdun had shown that the war would continue, a conflict that would drag on for years, with no clear victor in sight. Verdun's legacy was one of immense human suffering. It became a symbol of the horrors of industrialized warfare, where soldiers were sent to the front lines to fight and die in conditions that were unimaginable to those back home. The battle left a deep scar on the collective memory of the French people, and its impact on the soldiers who fought there would resonate for years to come. But Verdun was not just a French experience. It was a reminder of the totalizing nature of the war. For the Germans, the failure at Verdun was a costly one, and the high casualties they suffered would haunt their military efforts for the remainder of the war. For both sides, Verdun was a stark example of the inhumanity of the conflict, a reminder of the lengths to which both sides were willing to go to outlast the other. As the years passed, Verdun would become a symbol of France's determination to survive the war and a memorial to the fallen. The city, which had been reduced to rubble, was rebuilt, and monuments were erected to honor the bravery of those who fought. The names of the soldiers who had fallen at Verdun were etched into the walls of memorials, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Ultimately, the Battle of Verdun was a battle in which neither side emerged victorious. The Germans failed to break the French resolve, and the French, though they held their ground, suffered unimaginable losses. It was a testament to the human cost of war, a reminder that victory, in such a conflict, was elusive and costly. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, an event that reverberated across the world, signaling the collapse of one of the oldest and most enduring civilizations in history. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, had survived for over 1,000 years, weathering countless invasions, internal strife, and the slow encroachment of enemies from both East and West. But in 1453, it would succumb to an assault by one of the most formidable and innovative military powers of the time, the Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Mehmed II. For centuries, Constantinople had been a symbol of Eastern Christianity, the cultural and intellectual heart of the Byzantine world, and the bridge between Europe and Asia. Strategically located on the Bosporus Strait, it was the crossroads of East and West, with its immense walls guarding access to the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and surrounding regions. The city was rich in culture, philosophy, and wealth, but it was also encircled by powerful enemies eager to claim its riches and its influence. By the 15th century, however, the once thriving Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and a handful of surrounding territories. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, had grown exponentially in size and power. Under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottomans had become a dominant force in the region, steadily eroding the territories of the Byzantine Empire and those of their allies. Mehmed, determined to bring about the final fall of Constantinople, saw the city as the crown jewel of his empire, and his conquest would cement his place in history as one of the most successful military leaders of all time. In the months leading up to the siege, Mehmed began assembling one of the most formidable military forces the world had ever seen. Estimates suggest that the Ottoman army numbered between 80,000 and 150,000 men, with a vast range of soldiers, including elite janissaries, cavalry, archers, and engineers. In contrast, the defenders of Constantinople, led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, numbered a mere 7,000, including a mixture of Greeks, Italians, and mercenaries who had been hired to aid in the defense. The disparity in numbers was staggering, but the defenders had something the Ottomans did not: the Great Walls of Constantinople. The city's fortifications were legendary. The Theodosian walls, built during the 5th century, were a marvel of engineering, with multiple layers of defense, including a massive outer wall, a moat, and a series of towers designed to withstand attacks from all directions. The Byzantines had successfully defended the city from previous sieges, most famously during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the Venetians and Crusaders had attempted to capture the city. But this time, the Ottoman army was unlike any the city had ever faced. Mehmed's strategy was not just to starve the city into submission, as had been done in earlier sieges, but to methodically destroy the defenses and force a final assault. The Ottomans brought with them the most advanced artillery of the time, including massive cannons capable of firing enormous stones, some of which weighed several hundred pounds. These massive guns were used to pound the walls of Constantinople day after day, creating breaches that the Ottomans could exploit. Despite the impressive walls, they began to crumble under the weight of the relentless bombardment. The siege lasted for nearly 2 months, with the Ottomans maintaining a continuous bombardment on the walls, while the defenders struggled to repair the damage and defend their positions. The situation inside Constantinople became increasingly dire, as food and water supplies dwindled, and the defenders grew weary from days of constant fighting. The people of Constantinople, once hopeful that help might arrive, soon realized that their allies in Europe, including the Pope, were not coming to their aid. The Western Christian world, torn by internal divisions and the preoccupation with their own issues, failed to send sufficient assistance. The defenders of the city were on their own. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, knew the gravity of the situation. Despite the overwhelming odds, he refused to surrender. His leadership, however, could not overcome the technological and numerical superiority of the Ottomans. The defenders fought valiantly, but each day brought the Ottomans closer to their goal. As the siege wore on, the Ottomans began to make more focused attempts to breach the walls. The massive cannon fire continued, and smaller-scale attacks began to wear down the city's defenses. On May 22, the Ottomans launched a series of smaller but more concentrated assaults on the weakened portions of the walls. At the same time, Mem made an unprecedented move. He ordered the construction of a massive naval blockade, ensuring that no reinforcements could reach the city by sea. The Byzantines' attempts to break the blockade were unsuccessful, and the city's fate was sealed. Finally, on May 29, 1453, after weeks of brutal siege warfare, the Ottomans launched their final assault. The defenders fought with everything they had, but the sheer force of the Ottoman army overwhelmed the city. The walls of Constantinople, once thought impregnable, were breached in several places, and the Ottomans poured into the city. The battle that followed was chaotic and desperate, with the defenders fighting to the last man. The city fell in a bloody and violent climax, marking the end of over 1,000 years of Byzantine history. The fall of Constantinople was a catastrophic blow for Christendom. The city's capture by the Ottomans would have profound consequences for both the Christian and Muslim worlds. For the Ottomans, it marked the beginning of an era of expansion, as the city became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, renamed Istanbul. The conquest of Constantinople allowed the Ottomans to control vital trade routes between Europe and Asia, further strengthening their empire and their position as a dominant power in the region. For Europe, the fall of Constantinople was seen as a disaster. The loss of the city meant the end of Christian rule in the East, and it opened the door for further Ottoman expansion into Europe. It also contributed to the eventual decline of the Byzantine Empire's influence, and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as the preeminent power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The cultural and intellectual significance of Constantinople's fall cannot be understated. For centuries, Constantinople had been a beacon of learning, art, and philosophy, preserving much of the ancient Greek and Roman knowledge that had been lost to the West. After the fall of the city, many Greek scholars fled to the West, carrying with them invaluable manuscripts and knowledge that would later contribute to the European Renaissance. In this way, the fall of Constantinople indirectly helped to ignite a cultural rebirth in Europe, as the West absorbed the lost treasures of ancient Greece and Rome. As the Ottomans took control of the city, they quickly set about transforming Constantinople into their capital. They built grand mosques, palaces, and bridges, leaving a lasting legacy that still shapes the city's identity today. The Hagia Sophia, once the grand cathedral of Eastern Christianity, was converted into a mosque, symbolizing the triumph of Islam over Christianity in the city. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, was not merely the collapse of a city, but the final chapter in the storied history of the Byzantine Empire. It marked the end of the ancient world and the dawn of a new era, altering the course of history in profound ways that extended far beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks had a domino effect, influencing everything from the Renaissance in Europe to the spread of Islam, and even the global course of exploration. For the Ottoman Empire, the victory at Constantinople was monumental. It established Sultan Mehmed II as one of the most renowned conquerors in history and transformed the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a dominant global empire. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, shifting the political and economic center of the Eastern Mediterranean to the Ottomans. Istanbul's strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, coupled with its status as a major trading hub, allowed the Ottomans to control key trade routes and consolidate their power over vast territories. Yet the importance of this city was not merely geopolitical. Constantinople had been the intellectual and cultural heart of the Eastern Orthodox Christian world for centuries. It was home to the famous Hagia Sophia, the cathedral that stood as a symbol of the Byzantine Empire's religious and architectural grandeur. Following the conquest, the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, its Christian iconography covered or destroyed, and the structure was modified to reflect the Islamic faith that now dominated the city. This act symbolized the transformation of the city, where Christian civilization had flourished for more than a millennium, into the epicenter of the Islamic world. The Ottoman conquest also set the stage for a period of territorial expansion. With Constantinople as their base, the Ottomans would go on to conquer vast swathes of Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Their reach extended from the shores of the Adriatic to the deserts of Arabia, and the Ottoman Empire became a dominant political and military force for the next several centuries. But the effects of the fall of Constantinople extended far beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire, and had far-reaching consequences for the rest of the world. In Europe, the fall of Constantinople represented a devastating blow to Christendom. The Byzantine Empire had long been the eastern arm of Christianity, its imperial authority closely tied to the Eastern Orthodox Church. The fall of Constantinople signified the end of Christian rule in the East, a dramatic and irreversible shift in the balance of power between the Islamic world and the Christian West. Yet this loss, however tragic, would also set in motion forces that would eventually lead to a cultural rebirth in Europe. The humanists of Renaissance Italy, scholars who were eager to recover the classical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, saw an opportunity in the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople. Many Byzantine scholars, fleeing the city as it fell to the Ottomans, brought with them invaluable manuscripts and texts that had been lost to the West for centuries. This influx of Greek philosophical, scientific, and literary works sparked the Renaissance in Europe. The rediscovery of ancient texts, many of them written by the likes of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer, contributed to a revival of classical learning, which would go on to inspire the great minds of the Renaissance, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople also had profound effects on the trajectory of European exploration. In the wake of the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans controlled many of the key trade routes that linked Europe to Asia. This shift in power and control over the flow of goods spurred European nations to seek alternative routes to the east, which ultimately led to the Age of Exploration. The Portuguese and Spanish, in particular, began to explore new maritime routes around Africa and the Americas in search of spices, gold, and new territories. Christopher Columbus's historic voyage in 1492, which led to the discovery of the Americas, was one such result of this search for new trade routes. In essence, the fall of Constantinople indirectly triggered the wave of exploration that would change the world forever. On a cultural level, the fall of Constantinople also marked the end of an era in Christian history. For the Eastern Orthodox Church, the fall of Constantinople represented the loss of its most important city and its greatest religious and cultural symbol. The Church's center of power shifted from Constantinople to Moscow, which began to see itself as the Third Rome, the new heart of Orthodox Christianity. This new religious center would continue to shape Eastern European politics for centuries to come. The Byzantine emperors had long seen themselves as the protectors of Orthodox Christianity, and with the loss of their capital, the fate of the Eastern Orthodox Church became intertwined with the rise of the Russian Empire. The fall of Constantinople also influenced the spread of Islamic culture and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottomans took control of the city, they not only integrated Constantinople's wealth, culture, and prestige into their empire, but they also extended Islam's influence across Europe. The Ottomans were able to establish a flourishing society, integrating both Islamic and local Byzantine traditions. While many of the churches were turned into mosques, the Ottomans adopted and preserved aspects of Byzantine architecture, science, and scholarship, thereby blending the two civilizations into a unique hybrid culture. But perhaps the most poignant legacy of the fall of Constantinople was its impact on the collective memory of Europe and the wider world. The event became a symbol of the vulnerability of ancient civilizations to the forces of time and conflict. In the centuries following the conquest, the fall of Constantinople was memorialized in art, literature, and religious thought, serving as a powerful reminder of the fragility of empires and the inevitable ebb and flow of history. For the Western world, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and the need to be vigilant against the rise of powerful adversaries. In the end, the fall of Constantinople represents both an end and a beginning. The end of the Byzantine Empire, the end of the Eastern Christian dominance of the Mediterranean, and the end of the ancient Roman legacy in the East. But it also marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's rise as a world power, the beginning of the Renaissance, the beginning of global exploration, and the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the East and West. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of cultures clashing and blending, of civilizations rising and falling, and of a city that stood as a symbol of the past for over 1,000 years before it finally succumbed to the forces of history. The year was 1571, and the Mediterranean world was on the brink of a monumental clash. At the heart of this tumultuous period was the ongoing struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the forces of Christian Europe, led by Spain and the Papal States. This battle, now enshrined in history as the Battle of Lepanto, would not only be a decisive naval confrontation but also a pivotal turning point in the struggle for dominance over the Mediterranean and, more broadly, the fate of the Western and Eastern worlds. It was a battle that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The Ottomans, under the leadership of Sultan Selim II, had established their supremacy over vast swathes of territory, including much of the Mediterranean. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had grown so powerful that it was capable of threatening the very heart of Christendom. The Mediterranean, a sea that had once been the crossroads of trade, culture, and religion, was now at the center of a contest for global power between the two great rival factions, the Christian West and the Islamic East. The Ottomans controlled much of the coastlines, having already conquered Constantinople in 1453 and expanded across much of North Africa, the Levant, and into the Balkans. However, the Christian powers of Europe, particularly Spain, Venice, and the Papal States, were determined to halt Ottoman expansion. In 1565, the Ottomans had successfully laid siege to the Maltese island of Malta, marking a significant victory for the Ottomans. But despite the Ottoman fleet's successes, they had failed to deal a decisive blow to the Christian powers in the Mediterranean. In response to this growing Ottoman dominance, Pope Pius V called for a united Christian response, organizing a coalition of European states to challenge Ottoman control of the Mediterranean. The Christian forces, led by Don Juan of Austria, the half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, would be tasked with confronting the Ottoman fleet. The stakes were incredibly high. The Mediterranean was a lifeline for trade, military strategy, and political influence. A victory for the Ottomans could have solidified their control over the region for generations to come, while a defeat could halt their advance into Europe. The Battle of Lepanto, set to take place on October 7, 1571, would be the ultimate contest between two empires, with the fate of the Mediterranean world hanging in the balance. The battle itself was fought near the Gulf of Patras, in western Greece, and involved one of the largest naval clashes in history. On one side stood the Ottoman fleet, which numbered around 230 ships, including galleys, support vessels, and troops. On the other side was the Holy League, a coalition of Catholic powers, which boasted a fleet of around 200 ships, commanded by Don Juan. The Holy League included Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and other Italian city-states, all of whom sought to protect Christian Europe from further Ottoman expansion. The battle was fought primarily with galleys, the long, oared ships that had been the dominant naval vessel for centuries. These ships, maneuverable and deadly in close combat, were equipped with rows of oarsmen and mounted with cannons. The outcome of the battle would depend not only on firepower but also on the strategy and coordination of the fleets. Both sides prepared with fervent determination, aware that the outcome of this clash would have consequences far beyond the battle itself. As the battle unfolded, the Holy League fleet gained the upper hand through a combination of superior tactics, more advanced weaponry, and the resolute leadership of Don Juan. The Ottomans, despite their overwhelming numbers, were unable to match the skill and coordination of the Christian forces. The Holy League fleet outmaneuvered the Ottomans, concentrating their forces in key areas, overwhelming the Ottoman ships, and breaking their lines. The battle was brutal, with heavy casualties on both sides, but by the end of the day, the Holy League had emerged victorious. Around 30,000 Ottoman soldiers and sailors were killed or captured, while the Holy League lost fewer than 10,000 men. The defeat at Lepanto was a devastating blow for the Ottoman Empire, both strategically and psychologically. The loss of so many ships and men, and the destruction of the Ottoman fleet, severely weakened Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean for years to come. It marked the first major naval defeat for the Ottomans in centuries and signaled to Europe that the Ottoman Empire was not invincible. The Ottoman navy's inability to maintain its dominance over the Mediterranean would have long-lasting effects on the empire's ability to project power into Europe. However, the victory at Lepanto did not spell the end of the Ottoman Empire's ambitions. Despite their loss, the Ottomans remained a powerful force in the region, and their empire would continue to expand for decades. Yet the battle shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean, signaling the beginning of the end for Ottoman naval supremacy. For Europe, the victory at Lepanto represented a triumph of Christian unity, with the Holy League emerging as the victor in a battle that had seemed to favor the Ottomans just years before. In the aftermath of the battle, Pope Pius V declared a special day of thanksgiving, and the victory was celebrated as a momentous achievement for the Christian world. The battle was widely portrayed as a divine intervention, a victory that had been granted by God to preserve the Christian world from Ottoman domination. For centuries, the Battle of Lepanto remained a symbol of Christian triumph over Islamic forces, and it became a part of European religious and cultural identity. The Holy League's victory helped to solidify the idea of a Christian Europe standing against the forces of Islam, and became a defining moment in the centuries-long struggle between the two civilizations. Yet the legacy of Lepanto is not just about the immediate military victory. The battle had far-reaching effects that transcended its historical moment. The Ottoman defeat at Lepanto marked the beginning of a shift in the Mediterranean world. The Ottomans, though still a powerful empire, were no longer able to control the seas with the same level of dominance they had previously enjoyed. The victory by the Christian coalition allowed European powers, particularly Spain and Venice, to secure their influence in the region and even expand their empires. The Battle of Lepanto also had cultural and political ramifications that affected the course of European history. It is no accident that the battle came during the Renaissance, an era when the cultural and intellectual achievements of the West were beginning to flourish. The victory at Lepanto was viewed by many as a sign of divine favor for the Christian world and its resurgence. It reinforced the idea that European civilization, as a beacon of Christianity, was destined to overcome the challenges posed by the Ottomans and other Islamic powers. In the years following the battle, the papacy and European monarchies would continue to shape the political and religious landscape of Europe, often through military and naval interventions against the Ottomans. However, the legacy of Lepanto is not only defined by religious and political motivations. The battle also serves as a symbol of the complex interactions between cultures and civilizations. The year was 1453, and the fate of one of the most legendary cities in history was about to be sealed. The city of Constantinople, a name that conjures images of immense wealth, unrivaled architectural grandeur, and centuries of political and cultural dominance, was on the verge of falling into the hands of the Ottoman Empire. This event, one of the most significant in medieval history, marked not only the end of the Byzantine Empire but also the close of a chapter in the history of the Roman world. The fall of Constantinople was a seismic event that reverberated across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. It had survived numerous sieges, invasions, and internal strife, but by the mid-15th century it was clear that its time was running out. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by centuries of decline, was no longer the great power it once was. The Ottoman Empire, under the ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, had grown into a formidable force in the region, and Constantinople was now its ultimate prize. Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, ascended to the throne in 1451 at the age of 19. His reign would be defined by one singular ambition, the conquest of Constantinople. It was a goal he had long cherished, one that was deeply personal. Mehmed believed that capturing Constantinople would not only solidify his position as a powerful ruler but also cement his place in history. For the Ottomans, the city was the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, a symbol of Christian dominance that had long stood in the way of Ottoman expansion. For centuries, Constantinople had withstood attempts at conquest, but now, with the Ottomans poised on its doorstep, its fate seemed all but sealed. At the time of the siege, the Byzantine Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, was in dire straits. The empire was reduced to a shadow of its former self, with Constantinople as its last remaining stronghold. The city, though impressive in its fortifications and wealth, was isolated and surrounded by Ottoman forces on all sides. The once great Byzantine military had deteriorated over time, and the empire's finances were in ruins. The prospect of outside help from Western Europe, long a distant hope for the Byzantines, seemed increasingly unlikely as tensions between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East persisted. The siege of Constantinople began on April 6, 1453, when Mehmed II's army arrived outside the city's massive walls. The Ottomans had a sizable force, numbering between 80,000 and 100,000 men, and they brought with them a formidable arsenal of weapons, including massive cannons capable of breaching the city's ancient walls. The Byzantines, on the other hand, could muster a much smaller defense, with an estimated force of around 7,000 men, including soldiers, mercenaries, and civilian volunteers. The odds were heavily stacked against the defenders, but the city's walls, which had withstood centuries of sieges, were still a formidable obstacle. Mehmed's army, however, was not just large, it was also technologically advanced. The Ottoman Sultan had invested heavily in the development of heavy artillery, including the famous Great Bombard, a massive cannon capable of firing enormous projectiles. The cannon, which was brought to the city by skilled engineers, would prove to be a key element in the Ottoman siege strategy. The use of gunpowder artillery in the assault on Constantinople marked a significant shift in military tactics, signaling the end of an era for medieval warfare and the rise of gunpowder as a decisive factor in combat. As the Ottoman forces encircled Constantinople, the defenders realized that their situation was dire. The city's walls, though imposing, were vulnerable to the massive cannons being used by the Ottomans. The Byzantines attempted to hold their ground, using every available resource to fortify the walls and defend the city. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, despite the overwhelming odds, remained determined to protect the city, rallying his forces and encouraging them to fight for the survival of the Byzantine Empire. In the days that followed, the Ottomans launched a relentless bombardment of the city's walls, firing their massive cannons day and night. The defenders did their best to repair the damage, but the constant barrage took its toll. The walls of Constantinople, once thought impenetrable, began to show signs of weakness. The situation grew increasingly desperate as the Ottomans advanced closer to the city's gates. In addition to the siege itself, the Ottomans sought to cut off Constantinople's vital supply lines. The city had always relied on trade and resources from the surrounding areas, and with the Ottomans controlling the seas, it was impossible for the defenders to receive reinforcements or supplies. The Byzantine defenders were left to fight with what little they had, and their ability to hold out was rapidly diminishing. As the siege wore on, the situation inside the city grew increasingly dire. Famine and disease began to spread among the population, further weakening the already beleaguered defenders. In a last-ditch effort to save the city, Emperor Constantine XI sent desperate pleas for help to the Western powers, including the Pope and the rulers of Europe. However, the response was slow, and by the time reinforcements finally arrived, it was too late. The Pope had agreed to send a small force of soldiers and supplies, but the political rift between the Catholic and Orthodox churches was too deep to overcome in time. The Western powers, still embroiled in their own struggles, were unwilling to commit the resources necessary to save Constantinople. By May 22, 1453, after weeks of intense fighting and bombardment, the Ottomans had breached the walls of Constantinople. The city was now in grave danger, and the defenders were faced with the stark reality that the end was near. Mehmed, ever the strategist, ordered a final, all-out assault on the city. The Byzantines, exhausted and outnumbered, fought valiantly to the last, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer size and power of the Ottoman forces. The final assault came on May 29, 1453. The Ottomans poured into the city, and the defenders, despite their best efforts, were unable to prevent the inevitable. Emperor Constantine XI, realizing that the city was lost, led a final charge against the Ottomans, but he was killed in battle. With the emperor dead, the last remnants of Byzantine resistance crumbled. Constantinople had fallen. The fall of Constantinople was a watershed moment in history. The Byzantine Empire, which had once been a center of art, philosophy, and power, ceased to exist. The city of Constantinople, with its great churches, palaces, and libraries, was now in the hands of the Ottomans. Mehmed II, the victor, declared the city to be the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, renaming it Istanbul. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul marked the beginning of a new era in the history of the Mediterranean world. The fall of Constantinople had profound implications for Europe and the rest of the world. It marked the end of Christian Byzantine rule in the eastern Mediterranean and the rise of Islamic Ottoman power. The Ottomans would go on to become one of the most powerful empires in the world, controlling vast territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The dawn of the 15th century heralded a period of seismic shifts in the world's geopolitical landscape, brought about by the bold navigations and explorations of European powers. It was an age when the known world expanded, when vast oceans that had previously been seen as insurmountable barriers became highways for adventure and commerce. The Age of Exploration, also known as the Age of Discovery, was fueled by a combination of curiosity, technological advancements, and a desire for wealth, glory, and the spread of religious ideals. This was a time when entire continents, unknown to the people of Europe, were discovered, and the course of history was altered in the blink of an eye. The Age of Exploration was not a singular event but a gradual unfolding, driven by multiple individuals and nations. The Iberian Peninsula, particularly Spain and Portugal, would lead the charge in this monumental era. These nations, situated on the edges of Europe, were uniquely positioned to venture into the vast unknown. With a combination of maritime traditions, royal patronage, and growing advancements in navigation, Spain and Portugal sought to extend their influence, both politically and economically, by seeking new trade routes and territories. The first major event of the Age of Exploration came with the voyages of Portuguese navigator, Prince Henry the Navigator. Though he himself did not sail on any expeditions, Prince Henry's vision and support for exploration laid the groundwork for Portugal's dominance in maritime exploration. His establishment of a navigation school in the city of Sagres in the 1410s brought together the best minds, from cartographers to astronomers to shipbuilders. It was here that many of the technologies and techniques that would drive future explorations were developed. Prince Henry's main goal was to find a sea route to the wealth of India and the Far East, bypassing the overland routes that were controlled by rival powers like the Ottomans. At the time, the Muslim empires controlled much of the land routes to the east, and Portuguese explorers sought to find an alternative by sailing south along the coast of Africa. With their caravels, a new type of ship designed for long voyages, the Portuguese began to explore the western coast of Africa, mapping its coastlines and establishing trading posts along the way. In 1488, one of Prince Henry's protégés, Bartholomew Dias, reached the southernmost tip of Africa, known as the Cape of Good Hope. This was a monumental achievement, proving that a sea route to the Indian Ocean was indeed possible. Dias's voyage paved the way for further exploration, culminating in the historic journey of Vasco da Gama. In 1498, da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and all the way to Calicut, modern-day Kerala, India, becoming the first European to reach India by sea. This was a watershed moment in world history. The sea route to Asia had been found, and Portugal now held a significant strategic advantage in the world of trade, particularly in the lucrative spice trade. Meanwhile, Spain, eager to establish its own maritime empire, began to look westward. Spain's most famous explorer, Christopher Columbus, believed the fastest route to Asia lay not around Africa but across the Atlantic Ocean. Though his calculations were flawed, and he greatly underestimated the size of the Earth, Columbus was granted support by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain in 1492. They sought to expand their influence and wealth by finding new trade routes. Columbus, convinced that Asia lay just beyond the Atlantic, set sail with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. On October 12, 1492, after months of uncertain sailing, Columbus and his crew landed on an island in the Caribbean, which he named San Salvador. Though he had reached the islands of the Caribbean, he believed he had arrived at the outskirts of Asia, never realizing that he had uncovered an entirely new continent. Columbus made several more voyages to the Americas, but the impact of his journey was immense. It set the stage for the subsequent European colonization of the New World, as Spain and other powers began to vie for control over these newly discovered lands. The Americas, however, were not the only world-changing discoveries during this period. The search for new trade routes continued across the globe. The Magellan Expedition, 1519 to 1522, led by Ferdinand Magellan, proved the roundness of the Earth and established the feasibility of circumnavigating the globe. Though Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, his fleet continued the journey, and his expedition became the first to sail completely around the world. This was a further confirmation that the world was connected in ways that had once seemed impossible. As these explorers made their way across the globe, new continents were revealed, old civilizations were encountered, and a host of new challenges and conflicts arose. The age of exploration led to the rise of powerful European empires, each trying to secure its place in the new world order. Spain and Portugal were the early leaders in this global race, but soon France, England, and the Netherlands would also stake their claims in the Americas and Asia. The competition for territory was fierce, and it sparked a new wave of colonization that would reshape the geopolitical map. The impact of the age of exploration was far-reaching, and its consequences were felt across the world. On one hand, it spurred the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures between East and West. The opening of new trade routes to the Americas and Asia brought exotic goods like spices, silks, and precious metals into European markets. This contributed to the rise of a new class of merchants and fueled the growth of capitalism in Europe. The influx of wealth from the Americas helped finance the expansion of European empires and allowed European nations to establish themselves as dominant world powers. However, the age of exploration also had dark consequences. It was during this time that the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest, as European powers sought to exploit the resources of the Americas. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland, transported across the Atlantic, and enslaved to work on sugar plantations, in mines, and other industries in the New World. This brutal system of exploitation would have long-lasting effects on Africa, the Americas, and the entire world, contributing to centuries of suffering and inequality. In addition, the encounter between Europeans and indigenous populations in the Americas was often violent and devastating. Conquistadors, like Hernán Cortés in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru, brought with them not only guns and steel but also deadly diseases such as smallpox. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to these diseases, and entire populations were decimated. The cultural and social upheaval caused by European colonization left scars that would persist for centuries. Despite the numerous consequences, both positive and negative, the age of exploration was undeniably transformative. It set the stage for the globalized world we live in today. The establishment of global trade routes, the growth of empires, and the rise of new ideas all stemmed from the courage and curiosity of explorers who dared to venture into the unknown. It was a time of discovery, but also of exploitation, conquest, and tragedy. The world had changed, and it would never be the same again. The 14th century witnessed the rise of one of the most powerful empires in world history, the Ottoman Empire. Stretching from the heart of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to the gates of Europe, the empire's influence would last for over 600 years, shaping the course of history in the eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, the Middle East, and beyond. Its origins, however, were modest, beginning as a small Turkish principality on the fringes of the Seljuk Sultanate. Over time, the Ottomans would become a dominant force, blending military prowess, strategic diplomacy, and cultural tolerance to create an empire that stood at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. In 1299, the first Ottoman ruler, Osman I, established the dynasty that would carry his name. The empire was born out of the decline of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had once been a powerful Islamic state in Anatolia. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century had severely weakened the Seljuks, and in the power vacuum that followed, many small Turkish principalities, known as beyliks, began to rise. Osman's beylik, initially a modest tribal federation, quickly grew in power and influence, aided by his military success and ability to unite various Turkish tribes under his banner. The Ottomans' rise coincided with the decline of the Byzantine Empire, a once powerful Christian empire that had controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. By the 14th century, the Byzantines were severely weakened, their power shrinking with every passing decade. The Ottomans, initially focusing on expanding their control over Anatolia, soon turned their attention to the Byzantines, who occupied the strategically important city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople would become one of the most significant events in world history, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of the Ottoman domination of the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman military, known for its discipline and advanced tactics, played a central role in this expansion. Led by Sultan Mehmed II, who would later earn the title the Conqueror, the Ottomans launched a siege of Constantinople in 1453. Despite the city's formidable walls and its long history as the heart of Christianity in the East, Mehmed's army, with its use of massive cannons and sophisticated siege techniques, was able to breach the city's defenses. On May 29, 1453, after months of siege, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. The Byzantine Empire, which had once been a beacon of Christianity and culture in the East, was no more. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in world history. The Ottoman Empire had gained control of one of the most important cities in the world, a crossroads of trade and culture between Europe and Asia. The Ottomans quickly set about transforming the city, renaming it Istanbul, and making it the new capital of their burgeoning empire. The Hagia Sophia, the grand church of the Eastern Orthodox Church, was converted into a mosque, symbolizing the changing religious and cultural landscape of the region. This event would also have profound consequences for Europe, as the Ottomans now controlled the passage between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, which had long been a vital trade route. As the Ottomans consolidated their power in the East, they also began to expand into Europe. The empire's reach stretched into the Balkans, Hungary, and even parts of Eastern Europe. Under the leadership of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans reached the height of their territorial expansion in the 16th century, with the empire spanning 3 continents. Suleiman's reign, from 1520 to 1566, saw the Ottomans become one of the most powerful empires in the world, both militarily and economically. His military campaigns in Europe, Asia, and North Africa helped solidify Ottoman dominance in the Mediterranean. Suleiman's success was not only due to his military might but also to his ability to maintain a stable, centralized government. The Ottoman system of governance, known as the millet system, allowed for a degree of autonomy among the empire's diverse religious and ethnic communities. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived under the Ottoman banner, and although the Muslim elite held political power, the milites were allowed to govern themselves in matters of religion and personal law. This system of religious tolerance and coexistence helped to maintain peace and order in a vast and diverse empire. The Ottoman Empire also became a cultural and intellectual hub during this period, particularly in Istanbul. The city flourished with the construction of architectural masterpieces like the Süleymanî Mosque, built by the famous architect Mimar Sinan. Ottoman artists, poets, and scholars contributed to a vibrant cultural renaissance, drawing inspiration from both Islamic traditions and the classical heritage of ancient Greece and Rome. Ottoman art, architecture, and literature flourished, blending traditional Islamic motifs with the unique elements of the empire's diverse peoples. However, by the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire began to experience significant challenges. The rise of European maritime powers, such as Spain, Portugal, and later England and the Netherlands, threatened Ottoman control over vital trade routes. European nations began to establish their own colonies and trading networks, weakening the Ottoman monopoly on eastern trade. The empire's military, once unrivaled, began to stagnate, and its ability to project power in Europe began to wane. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was a turning point in this decline. The Ottoman fleet, once a dominant force in the Mediterranean, was decisively defeated by a coalition of Christian forces, including Spain and the Papal States. This battle marked the end of Ottoman expansion in Europe and signaled the beginning of the empire's slow decline. In addition to external threats, the empire faced internal challenges as well. Corruption among the ruling elite, administrative inefficiency, and economic decline undermined the Ottomans' ability to govern effectively. The once great empire, which had flourished for centuries, began to fragment, and the 19th century saw a series of military defeats, territorial losses, and uprisings within the empire's vast domains. The decline of the Ottoman Empire would be marked by the loss of its holdings in North Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East, culminating in the empire's eventual dissolution after World War I in 1918. Despite its eventual fall, the Ottoman Empire left a profound legacy that continues to influence the modern world. The empire's role as a cultural crossroads between East and West facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods, and technologies. The Ottoman legal system, based on Islamic law, influenced legal practices across the Middle East and beyond. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, from its humble beginnings to its imperial zenith, is a testament to the power of military innovation, diplomatic acumen, and cultural tolerance. Though it eventually succumbed to the pressures of modernity and external forces, the legacy of the Ottomans is etched into the history of Europe, the Middle East, and the wider world. Their influence can still be felt in the architecture, law, and culture of the regions they once ruled, a lasting reminder of an empire that bridged the continents and connected civilizations across the ages. By the dawn of the 20th century, the once glorious Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Once the dominant power of the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa, the empire had gradually lost much of its territory through a series of military defeats, internal strife, and the rise of nationalist movements among its diverse peoples. The empire, which had endured for over 6 centuries, found itself teetering on the brink of collapse, unable to withstand the pressures of modern warfare, nationalist uprisings, and the shifting tides of global power. The first signs of decline became evident in the 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire, struggling to keep up with the industrial advancements of Europe, began to lose its once formidable military edge. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the European powers, giving them not only military superiority but also the economic might to project power around the globe. The Ottoman state, in contrast, remained largely agrarian, with its economy based on traditional agricultural methods that were increasingly insufficient to compete with the rapidly growing industrialized economies of Europe. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, marked a significant moment in the empire's decline. Fought between the Russian Empire, supported by France and Britain, and the Ottoman Empire, the war was a result of Russian ambitions to expand into the Black Sea and the Balkans. Although the Ottomans, with their Western allies, managed to secure a victory, the war exposed the empire's vulnerabilities. The inability to modernize and the growing discontent among its population laid the foundation for the empire's later troubles. By the late 19th century, nationalist movements within the empire's diverse population began to gain momentum. Many of the Balkans, the Arab provinces, and various ethnic groups, inspired by the rise of nationalism across Europe, sought independence or autonomy from Ottoman rule. The Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, were particularly devastating for the Ottomans. The empire, once dominant in the region, lost nearly all of its European territories, reducing its presence in Europe to a small strip of land around Istanbul. The loss of the Balkans also meant the loss of a large proportion of the empire's Christian population, who had historically been a significant part of its ruling structure. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War in 1914 on the side of the Central Powers, aligning itself with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the hope of regaining its lost territories and stabilizing the empire. However, the war would only accelerate its decline. The Ottomans, already weakened by years of internal unrest and military defeats, faced coordinated attacks from the Allies, including British, French, and Russian forces. The Gallipoli Campaign, 1915 to 1916, in which Ottoman forces under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, later the founder of modern Turkey, famously repelled Allied invasions, provided a temporary boost to Ottoman morale. However, the empire was not able to sustain its military efforts and suffered significant losses throughout the war. The consequences of the war were catastrophic for the Ottoman Empire. Following their defeat, the Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, was imposed on the Ottomans by the victorious Allies. The treaty sought to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, leading to the loss of most of its remaining territories. The Arab provinces, including Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Arabia, were placed under British and French mandates, while Greece and other European powers took control of former Ottoman lands in the Balkans and Anatolia. The treaty also mandated the establishment of an independent Armenian state, further fragmenting the empire's territorial integrity. In response to the Treaty of Sèvres and the rising tide of nationalism within Anatolia, a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal, a former Ottoman military officer, began to gain strength. Kemal, who had played a pivotal role in the defense of Gallipoli, rallied the Turkish people to resist the partitioning of their lands. By 1923, after a series of military campaigns and the eventual victory of the nationalist forces, Kemal had established the Republic of Turkey, effectively bringing an end to the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Lausanne, 1923, recognized the new Turkish Republic and formally dismantled the Ottoman Empire, marking the end of over 600 years of Ottoman rule. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not just the collapse of a political entity, it was the end of an era. The Ottomans had once been the most powerful empire in the world, uniting a vast and diverse swath of lands, peoples, and cultures. The end of the empire, however, was not the end of its influence. The Ottoman legacy continued to shape the geopolitics of the 20th century, from the borders of modern-day Turkey to the conflicts that arose in the Middle East and the Balkans. The republic established by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk sought to modernize Turkey and break with the Ottoman past, but it also carried forward many of the social, cultural, and political legacies of the empire, albeit in a new, secular context. The Ottoman decline and fall also marked the end of a centuries-long era of Ottoman dominance in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the Balkans. While the empire had experienced a period of remarkable cultural and military achievements, its final years were marred by internal corruption, administrative inefficiency, and military decline. The rise of nationalism, the pressures of industrialization, and the changing nature of global power ultimately led to its downfall. As the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the international landscape shifted dramatically. New nation-states emerged, carving up the empire's former territories, while the legacy of Ottoman culture, law, and architecture continued to exert a profound influence on the regions it had once ruled. The fall of the empire signaled the end of an era in world history, but it also paved the way for the rise of new global powers and the reorganization of the Middle East and Europe in the aftermath of the First World War. The early 20th century was a period of profound political, economic, and social change. For centuries, the world had been divided into empires, vast territories ruled by monarchs, emperors, and colonial powers that spanned continents. However, as the century unfolded, the forces of nationalism began to challenge these imperial structures. From the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, to the collapse of the Habsburg Empire and the Russian Empire, the world saw the rise of new nation-states and the decline of imperial dominance. The rise of nationalism, a political ideology that emphasized the power and unity of people sharing a common heritage, language, and culture, would reshape the global order and set the stage for the emergence of a new world system. In the aftermath of World War I, empires that had once seemed invincible began to crumble. The Russian Empire was shattered by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, while the Habsburg Empire, a patchwork of different nationalities, disintegrated into a patchwork of smaller states. The Ottoman Empire had already been dismantled, and Germany, once a powerhouse, was humbled by defeat and stripped of its imperial possessions. At the heart of this transformation was the idea of national self-determination. As the map of Europe and the Middle East was redrawn after the war, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, sought to carve out new nations from the ruins of the old empires. The treaty, which officially ended the war, established the principle that peoples with a common ethnic or cultural identity should have the right to form their own sovereign states. This principle led to the creation of new countries such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, both of which were carved from the lands of the Habsburg Empire. However, the push for nationalism was not limited to Europe. In colonial territories, nationalism was also on the rise. Colonized peoples, having experienced the horrors of war and the ideologies of freedom and independence that emerged from it, began to demand the same rights that European powers had granted themselves. The Indian independence movement is one of the most notable examples of this global wave of nationalism. Led by Mahatma Gandhi, the movement was rooted in the desire for self-rule and the rejection of British colonial domination. Gandhi's principle of nonviolent resistance, or satyagraha, inspired millions across India to engage in civil disobedience and protests. In 1947, the British Raj finally yielded to these demands, granting India independence and partitioning the subcontinent into two states, India and Pakistan. Similarly, African nationalism gained momentum after World War I. African soldiers who had fought in Europe during the war returned to their homelands with a new sense of purpose and awareness. They brought with them ideas of freedom, equality, and the rights of people to govern themselves. In the 1950s and 1960s, a wave of independence movements swept across Africa, leading to the formation of independent nations. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952, which saw the overthrow of the British-backed monarchy, was followed by other independence movements in West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa. The decline of European imperialism, however, was not an easy process. In many cases, the struggle for independence was long and bloody. The Algerian War of Independence, 1954–1962, fought between France and the National Liberation Front, FLN, was one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. Algeria's fight for freedom was marked by widespread violence, including terrorist attacks, brutal counterinsurgency operations, and a deep divide within French society about whether the war was worth fighting. In the end, after years of conflict and international pressure, France granted independence to Algeria, though the scars of the war would remain for decades. Another notable conflict during this period was the Vietnam War, which began as a nationalist struggle for independence from French colonial rule. The First Indochina War, 1946–1954, led to the defeat of France, but Vietnam was subsequently divided into two states, North Vietnam, led by the Communist Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States. The struggle for independence became increasingly complicated as Cold War tensions shaped the conflict. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, supported the South Vietnamese government in a brutal and costly war against the Communist North. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under Communist rule. Nationalism also sparked conflict in the Middle East, where the collapse of the Ottoman Empire left a vacuum of power. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers, particularly after World War I, led to tensions and divisions that persist to this day. In Palestine, tensions between Jewish and Arab nationalist movements resulted in violence, and the eventual creation of the State of Israel in 1948, leading to the first of several Arab-Israeli wars. The desire for a homeland among both Jews and Arabs clashed in a region that had been under British control. The legacy of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the complex promises made by the British to Arab leaders, created a volatile mix of competing nationalist aspirations. The wave of nationalism that swept across the globe in the 20th century didn't stop with the colonies. Even the imperial powers themselves would have to confront the forces of nationalism within their own borders. The Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, led to the creation of the Irish Free State, and Scotland, Wales, and Catalonia saw significant pushes for autonomy or independence within the larger states of Britain and Spain. As the 20th century unfolded, nationalism was no longer confined to the colonies. New nation-states were being born across the world, reshaping the geopolitical landscape. The decolonization process, which continued throughout the 1950s and 1960s, was a turning point in global history. The rise of independent nations and the collapse of empires, both colonial and dynastic, marked the end of an era. Nationalism had radically transformed the political map of the world by the end of the 20th century. The drive for independence, self-determination, and autonomy was no longer the exclusive domain of Western powers. Nations once subjected to foreign rule now took their place on the world stage, altering the balance of power. The rise of nationalism created a new world order, one defined not by empires, but by nation-states, where the aspirations of ethnic, cultural, and religious communities determined the course of history. The conclusion of World War II heralded the dawn of a new geopolitical order, one that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. The world, though united in victory over fascism, quickly found itself divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two giants, each representing a vastly different political and economic system, would come to symbolize the Cold War, a global standoff defined not by direct military confrontation, but by ideological, political, and economic rivalry. In the aftermath of the war, Europe lay in ruins, and the rest of the world was in need of reconstruction. However, rather than coming together in the spirit of cooperation, the two victorious powers, the US and the Soviet Union, quickly became bitter rivals, each vying for influence over the future of Europe and the world at large. The ideological divide between capitalism and communism led to one of the most intense periods of tension and conflict in modern history. The Cold War was characterized by a variety of political, military, and ideological confrontations, often played out in proxy wars, arms races, and diplomatic maneuvering. The central question of the Cold War was simple yet profound: which system, capitalism or communism, would shape the future of the world? The United States, emerging from World War II as the world's dominant economic and military power, championed the free market, democracy, and individual liberties. The U.S. sought to contain the spread of communism, which was associated with the totalitarian rule of the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin and later by other leaders such as Nikita Khrushchev, was a communist state that sought to export its ideology of Marxist-Leninist revolution to the rest of the world. This ideological conflict set the stage for a decades-long struggle for global dominance. The Berlin blockade in 1948 marked the first major confrontation of the Cold War. After the war, Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though located deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany, was also divided into 4 sectors. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency in their sectors of Berlin, the Soviets responded by blockading the city, attempting to force the Allies out. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, an unprecedented operation that involved the delivery of food, coal, and other supplies to the people of West Berlin by air. The blockade lasted nearly a year, and its resolution marked a victory for the West and a humiliating defeat for the Soviet Union. The Cold War was marked by numerous proxy wars, many of them in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the superpowers supported opposing sides in regional conflicts. In Korea, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, became the first major conflict of the Cold War. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into a Soviet-controlled North and an American-controlled South. The North, under Kim Il-sung, became a communist state, while the South, under Syngman Rhee, was aligned with the U.S. and the West. In 1950, North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded the South, triggering the Korean War. The war ended in an armistice in 1953, but Korea remained divided, with tensions between the two Koreas continuing to this day. Another key flashpoint of the Cold War was Vietnam. After the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, led to the defeat of France, Vietnam was divided into North Vietnam, led by the Communist Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States. In the 1960s, the U.S. escalated its involvement in the conflict, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War became one of the most controversial and tragic conflicts in modern history, resulting in the deaths of millions and the eventual fall of Saigon in 1975, marking the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. Throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an arms race that saw the development of increasingly powerful and destructive weapons. The advent of nuclear weapons and the proliferation of nuclear arsenals created a constant threat of global annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war when the Soviet Union installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. After tense negotiations, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, and President John F. Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba, defusing the crisis. The Cold War also played out in the world of espionage and covert operations. Both superpowers engaged in a fierce battle of intelligence, with agencies like the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the KGB, Committee for State Security, operating around the globe to gather information, influence events, and sometimes undermine each other's governments. The rivalry between the two superpowers manifested in numerous covert operations, including the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, the Iranian coup d'état of 1953, and the Afghan-Soviet War of the 1980s. In Latin America, the Cold War took a particularly dangerous turn. The Cuban Revolution of 1959, which brought Fidel Castro to power, was one of the most significant events of the Cold War in the Western Hemisphere. Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union made Cuba a key flashpoint for U.S. policymakers. In an attempt to overthrow Castro's regime, the U.S. backed the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which ended in failure. Tensions escalated throughout the 1960s and 1970s, as the U.S. sought to contain communist influence in the region, supporting authoritarian regimes in countries like Chile, Argentina, and Nicaragua, while the Soviet Union offered support to left-wing insurgencies and governments. The Cold War also led to the space race, a competition between the US and the Soviet Union to achieve technological supremacy. The Soviet Union shocked the world by launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. This prompted the United States to accelerate its space program, culminating in the successful landing of Apollo 11 on the Moon in 1969, with astronaut Neil Armstrong taking the first step on the lunar surface. By the 1970s, the Cold War began to show signs of détente, with both superpowers engaging in arms control agreements such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. However, the ideological battle continued, and the threat of nuclear war remained ever present. It wasn't until the 1980s, with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and his policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, that the Cold War began to wind down. Gorbachev's willingness to engage in dialogue with U.S. President Ronald Reagan led to the signing of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, which called for the elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons. Ultimately, the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, marking the triumph of capitalism and democracy over communism in the global ideological struggle. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was followed by the independence of many former Soviet republics and the end of the Warsaw Pact. The world that emerged from the Cold War was one of unipolarity, with the United States standing as the undisputed global superpower. As the world entered the 1980s, the Cold War, which had been a defining global struggle for nearly 4 decades, showed signs of change. For the Soviet Union, the system that had once stood as the strongest counterbalance to the West was beginning to crumble. By the end of the decade, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, would usher in a new era of reforms that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, forever altering the geopolitical landscape. Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership of the Soviet Union in 1985, inheriting a nation in decline. The Soviet economy was stagnating, and the state-controlled system was no longer able to compete with the growing economic power of the West. Gorbachev, a man of reformist ideals, recognized the need for change. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed at addressing both the political and economic crises that the Soviet Union was facing. Glasnost, or openness, sought to introduce greater transparency in government. Gorbachev allowed for more freedom of speech, reduced censorship, and opened the door for greater discussion on political and social issues. This marked a significant shift from the tightly controlled environment of previous Soviet leaderships. Citizens were encouraged to openly criticize the government, and the media began reporting on issues that had previously been suppressed. Perestroika, or restructuring, aimed at reviving the Soviet economy by decentralizing control and introducing some market-oriented reforms. Gorbachev recognized that the centralized, state-run economy was inefficient and unsustainable, but the changes came too slowly to have an immediate effect. While Gorbachev's reforms were meant to strengthen the Soviet system, they inadvertently exposed its deep flaws and sowed the seeds of its collapse. However, the reforms did not have the desired effect of reinvigorating the Soviet Union. Instead, they triggered a series of events that eventually led to the disintegration of the empire. Gorbachev's more open approach gave rise to political movements within the Soviet republics, many of which were already yearning for independence. As the Soviet Union's grip on its satellite states weakened, the winds of change began to blow through Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, was a powerful force for change. The labor union, which had been suppressed for years, had gained significant traction by the mid-1980s, organizing strikes and protests against the communist regime. By 1989, Poland held the first partially free elections in the Eastern Bloc, and Solidarity won a sweeping victory. This marked the beginning of the collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe. In Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, the situation was much the same. Citizens grew restless with the oppressive regimes, and one by one, the Eastern European nations began to push for greater freedoms. In Germany, the Berlin Wall, which had stood as a symbol of the Cold War division between East and West, began to crack. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall was opened, and East Germans flooded into West Berlin, marking the symbolic end of the Cold War division. Yet it was within the Soviet Union itself that the most dramatic changes were unfolding. In the late 1980s, nationalist movements began to gain momentum in the Soviet republics. The Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were among the first to declare their independence, a move that was followed by the republics of Georgia, Ukraine, and others. These declarations were met with force, as the Soviet government attempted to maintain control through military means. However, Gorbachev's reforms had already weakened the central government, and many Soviet troops were unwilling to suppress popular uprisings. In 1989, the Soviet-Afghan War, which had raged for nearly a decade, ended with a humiliating defeat for the Soviet Union. The conflict had been a disastrous attempt to prop up a communist government in Afghanistan, and its failure further undermined Soviet power and prestige on the world stage. This defeat not only further demoralized the Soviet people but also strained the economy and diverted resources away from domestic concerns. As the 1990s approached, the Soviet Union's disintegration became inevitable. The August 1991 coup was a final, desperate attempt by hardline communists to retain control over the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest by military leaders who opposed his reforms, and the coup seemed poised to restore the old regime. However, the coup failed, largely due to the public's overwhelming support for Gorbachev and his reforms, as well as the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, who emerged as a key figure in the defense of democracy in Russia. The coup's failure marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and Gorbachev resigned as its last leader. The Union of Republics that had held together the Soviet state for over 70 years disbanded, and the individual republics, including Russia, declared their independence. This momentous event had profound consequences for the global order. The Cold War had ended, but a new chapter in world history had begun. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, and its victory in the Cold War signaled the triumph of democracy, capitalism, and market-oriented economics. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union also led to a period of economic hardship and political instability for many of the former Soviet republics. For many Russians and citizens of former Soviet republics, the dissolution of the Soviet Union represented a bitter loss. The Russian Federation, under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, was left to navigate the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. The transition to a market economy and a democratic political system was difficult, with widespread corruption, poverty, and economic turmoil. Globally, the collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of a bipolar world order. The United States, now unchallenged, became the undisputed leader in international affairs. However, the breakup of the Soviet Union also led to the emergence of new conflicts and challenges, including the rise of Islamic extremism, regional tensions, and ethnic conflicts in the former Soviet republics. The end of the Cold War left a deep impact on the global psyche. The nuclear threat, which had loomed large for much of the 20th century, seemed to recede as both superpowers dismantled much of their nuclear arsenals. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union did not mean the end of global tensions. New challenges arose in the form of terrorism, regional conflicts, and the rise of new powers like China. As the 20th century came to a close, the world found itself entering an era of rapid globalization. The collapse of the Soviet Union opened the door for new international relationships, trade partnerships, and a new wave of democratization in Eastern Europe. However, the world remained deeply affected by the legacy of the Cold War. The struggle between ideologies, superpowers, and political systems had reshaped the course of the 20th century, and its echoes would reverberate well into the 21st century. As the world entered the 21st century, one nation that had been largely marginalized during much of the 20th century began to rise to prominence: China. The history of China's transformation is nothing short of extraordinary. As a once isolated communist nation, crippled by economic stagnation and political upheaval, became the second largest economy in the world. This chapter of Chinese history is centered on the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who would oversee the pivotal reforms that set the stage for China's dramatic economic rise. In the 1970s, China was in the midst of profound transformation. The country, having been led by Mao Zedong through decades of strict communist policies, was suffering from political instability, famine, and economic isolation. The Mao era had ended with a legacy of radical policies, such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which, though ideologically driven, resulted in millions of deaths and the country's widespread impoverishment. Following Mao's death in 1976, the power vacuum left behind was filled by Deng Xiaoping, who emerged as the paramount leader of China despite not officially holding the title of chairman. Deng's vision was markedly different from that of his predecessor. Recognizing that China's economy could not thrive under Maoist principles, Deng initiated a series of sweeping reforms that marked a profound shift in both the country's political philosophy and its economic structure. The central component of Deng's reforms was economic liberalization. In 1978, he introduced the concept of the socialist market economy, which allowed China to open up to private enterprise, market forces, and foreign investment while maintaining the Communist Party's firm grip on political power. This marked a stark departure from the strict central planning that had defined China under Mao. Deng's policies focused on modernizing China's agricultural sector, opening up the country to foreign trade, and investing in infrastructure. Special economic zones (SEZs) were established in coastal cities like Shenzhen, where foreign businesses could set up operations with fewer restrictions. These zones became the catalyst for China's remarkable economic growth. The early stages of reform saw China's economy grow at an impressive pace, with many sectors experiencing rapid development. Agricultural reform, which included allowing farmers to sell excess crops in open markets, led to an increase in productivity and improved living standards for millions of Chinese citizens. At the same time, China began to industrialize at a rapid rate, becoming a major hub for manufacturing and production. The Chinese government's ability to harness globalization and foreign investment laid the foundation for the country's eventual emergence as an industrial giant. However, the path to China's economic transformation was not without challenges. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 revealed the tensions within the country. The protests, which were primarily driven by students and intellectuals calling for political reforms and greater personal freedoms, were brutally suppressed by the government. The military crackdown resulted in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters, and the event became a defining moment in China's modern history. Despite this, the leadership of the Communist Party under Deng remained steadfast in its commitment to economic reform and its refusal to yield to political demands for democracy. The incident highlighted the stark contrast between China's economic liberalization and the ongoing political control maintained by the Communist Party. By the 1990s, China's economic reforms were beginning to pay off in dramatic fashion. The country's GDP was growing at an annual rate of over 10%, and China was rapidly becoming an attractive destination for foreign investment. As the world economy integrated in the age of globalization, China found itself increasingly connected to the global market. The country's membership in the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001 further solidified China's position in the international economic order. This was a pivotal moment in the nation's rise as it gained access to markets and became a critical player in global trade. The 2000s marked the peak of China's economic boom. The country emerged as the world's factory, manufacturing goods for export across the globe. Its cheap labor, vast infrastructure, and growing middle class made it a powerhouse in sectors ranging from technology and consumer goods to automobiles and textiles. But alongside this economic growth, China also began to focus on technological advancements, with heavy investments in research and development. The government's strategic planning led to the development of industries in high-tech sectors like electronics, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence, setting the stage for China to transition from being a manufacturing giant to a technological powerhouse. During this time, China's geopolitical influence began to grow significantly. The country's increasing economic and military power began to translate into greater political influence on the global stage. In the early 21st century, China began to assert itself as a global leader in international organizations like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013, aimed to create a vast infrastructure network across Asia, Europe, and Africa, further cementing China's influence over global trade routes and its relationships with countries around the world. China's rise as a global superpower has not been without its challenges. The Communist Party, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has faced growing international scrutiny over issues like human rights, freedom of speech, and territorial disputes in the South China Sea. The U.S.-China trade war in the late 2010s exposed tensions between China and the West, particularly over issues of intellectual property, trade imbalances, and geopolitical competition. In addition, the question of Taiwan and China's policies toward its self-governing neighbor continue to create instability in the region. China's military modernization has raised concerns among its neighbors and the United States, as the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region shifts dramatically. Despite these tensions, China remains a key player in the global order. Its economic influence has reshaped the global marketplace, and its growing technological prowess threatens to make it a rival to the United States in many domains, including artificial intelligence, 5G technology, and space exploration. The future of China is uncertain, but its rise as a global superpower is undeniable. For China, the 21st century presents both immense opportunities and significant challenges. The country's massive population, technological advancements, and economic power have positioned it as one of the world's leading nations. But as China continues to expand its influence across the globe, it must navigate complex geopolitical tensions, the challenges of its authoritarian system, and the increasing demand for political and social freedoms from its citizens. What is clear, however, is that China's rise is one of the most significant geopolitical events of the modern era, and its impact on global history will be felt for generations to come. As China continued to ascend in the global rankings, dominating the 21st century's economic and political landscape, the world watched closely, each nation calculating how to engage with the rising giant. The speed of China's economic transformation, its aggressive pursuit of technological and military superiority, and its growing international influence presented new dynamics to global diplomacy, trade, and power balances. The first significant reaction to China's rise came from the United States, the post-World War II superpower that had dominated global politics for much of the 20th century. Initially, the United States saw China's growth as a threat to its economic hegemony. During the 1990s and early 2000s, China's massive production capacity made it a trading partner for many Western nations, especially the U.S. Yet, as China's market share grew, so did its economic footprint, and the balance of trade began to shift. By the 2010s, the U.S. had experienced a noticeable trade deficit with China, with Chinese goods flooding American markets, while U.S. exports to China remained limited. The U.S.-China trade war, which began under President Donald Trump's administration in 2018, was a direct manifestation of this growing tension. The United States accused China of unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and other policies that it claimed gave Chinese firms an unfair advantage. In response, President Trump imposed heavy tariffs on Chinese imports, aiming to reduce the trade imbalance and challenge the economic rise of the Chinese state. These tariffs triggered retaliatory measures from China, leading to a tumultuous period of economic uncertainty. The trade war underscored how the geopolitical and economic challenges of dealing with a rapidly rising China were beginning to dominate global political discourse. At the same time, China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) had begun to reshape global trade routes. Launched in 2013, the BRI was a vast infrastructure project aimed at creating a network of roads, ports, railways, and pipelines to connect China with Central Asia, Africa, and Europe. The initiative, often compared to the Silk Road of ancient times, was seen as a strategic move by China to extend its influence across Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. However, critics of the BRI feared that China was leveraging its economic power to create debt traps, encouraging developing countries to take on unsustainable loans and risk their sovereignty. As China invested in massive infrastructure projects in nations like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Kenya, there were growing concerns that these investments were not purely altruistic but part of a broader geopolitical strategy to gain influence in key regions. The European Union (EU) also found itself grappling with the changing dynamics of China's rise. As China became the EU's largest trading partner in 2020, European countries had to balance their economic dependence on China with concerns over human rights, intellectual property theft, and the lack of political freedoms in China. Germany and France, among the EU's largest economies, were keen to deepen economic ties with China, particularly in sectors such as technology, automobiles, and manufacturing. However, there were disagreements within the EU over how to approach China's growing influence. While some member states pushed for stronger diplomatic and economic engagement with China, others, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, were cautious of China's influence on European policies. The growing competition between the US and China over trade, technology, and military power prompted a broader global realignment of alliances. Some countries, particularly in Asia, had to carefully navigate their positions. India, long a regional competitor to China, found itself caught in a balancing act. On the one hand, India was seeking to engage economically with China, especially in trade, and on the other, it feared China's military encroachment in the region. Tensions over the border dispute in the Himalayas flared several times, including a major military clash in 2020, reflecting the growing rivalry between the two nations. Despite these tensions, both India and China recognized the need for cooperation in certain areas, such as trade and regional security. China's military modernization also played a key role in its global influence. Xi Jinping, who assumed power in 2012, made it clear that China would assert its interests in the Asia-Pacific region. The country's increasingly powerful navy, air force, and missile capabilities were meant to ensure that China had the military muscle to defend its economic and territorial interests. The South China Sea, a crucial trade route and region rich in natural resources, became a flashpoint for China's military expansion. China's controversial Nine-Dash Line, which claims a vast area of the South China Sea, drew condemnation from countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, who also claimed territorial rights to parts of the waters. The United States, as the dominant military power in the Pacific, conducted regular freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, to challenge China's territorial claims and assert the principle of international law. Meanwhile, Russia, a longtime strategic ally of China, was also adjusting to the changing power dynamics. The two nations had enjoyed a partnership in recent years, particularly in the face of the West's growing criticism of both nations' domestic policies. The partnership allowed Russia to gain access to Chinese investment, technology, and markets, while China benefited from Russia's natural resources, particularly energy. However, even this alliance had its challenges. As China's military and economic power continued to grow, it began to overshadow Russia, raising concerns in Moscow about losing its influence in regions like Central Asia. As the United States and its allies worked to address the growing challenge posed by China, the world was faced with a fundamental question: how to engage with a rising superpower that was fundamentally reshaping the global order. Some advocates of engagement argued that cooperation with China in trade, climate change, and international diplomacy was essential, while others warned that China's rise, coupled with its authoritarian domestic policies and increasing military power, could lead to a new Cold War or a shift in global power that undermined the existing liberal international order. The international response to China's rise would shape the next several decades of geopolitics. Would China be a force for stability and global cooperation, or would its growing power spark increased tensions and competition? The answer to this question would depend on China's ability to navigate its own internal challenges, such as an aging population, environmental concerns, and political dissent, as well as its relationships with the rest of the world.